Hello Admirals and welcome back to my channel where I talk to you about the tabletop game Battlefleet Gothic, which is set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So in my last couple of videos I've talked you through the basics of the game and the various phases and everything, and I mentioned tactics in my last video. The beauty of Battlefleet Gothic is all the fleets typically operate in a very different way. Eldar do not play the same as Chaos or Imperials or Orcs or Tau. So each fleet has a distinct flavour to them. Eldar is quite fast and nimble, and they hit really hard with their guns, so they're kind of like glass cannons, because if you get them caught, then their armour is like wet paper and they can fold and be destroyed very easily. Space Marines are slow but really strong armour. Chaos have got big guns, and Tau love their ordnance with their torpedoes and fighters and bombers. But there are some general things that kind of can be applicable to all of the fleets. So I'm going to go through, and I'm going to give this a go, 10 tactical tips that work for every single fleet, generally speaking. So I hope you enjoy. These are generally kind of can be applicable to anywhere. So I hope you enjoy. Let's start off with number 1. So tip number 1 is keep your fleets together as best you can. Now there are some exceptions to this. There are exceptions to all of these tips, I should say. But when you are pulling your ship, especially fleets like the Imperials, Space Marines, or Tau, they rely heavily on their ships' mutual support, so mutual firing into specific targets. So pick a target, you fire all of your fleets into it, all of your fleet's weapons into it. This means that you get the most sort of bang for your buck firing, and you can cross the T in some instances, but also you can pick on lone threats and deal with them before having to deal with the rest of the fleet. So for example, in this situation against the Chaos, the Imperial fleet here can fire all 3 cruisers into one, along with the escorts then doing the same thing. And these other cruisers that are with them can't really reply in kind. So not only does this help provide a solid platform, a solid wall of guns and weapons to have to deal with, but it also allows you to sort of focus on a target, deal with it, and then move on. So generally speaking, it's a good idea to kind of keep your fleet together as best, and then sort of divide up later in the game when there's more opportunity to do so. Okay, tip number 2 is a pretty straightforward one in many respects, and it's kind of applicable to most war games realistically, and it's trying to work out your enemy's game plan essentially, but understanding where your ships will be and where potentially your enemy's ships will be will help you kind of work out what maneuvers and what potential orders you are going to use on your ships in response to, or sort of also kind of second guess where they're going to be. So in Battlefleet Gothic, because you know there is a minimum move for all ships, you know that all the ships are going to be moving forward at least, in this instance, 10 with the cruisers. So if you're Chaos, thinking ahead of where potentially the Imperials are going to fly will allow you to then maneuver your ship potentially forward and get a better angle, or maybe you want to bring it around and get a bit of a better shot into them as they're closing on you rather than they're a beam. In this instance with the Imperials, they're going to move forward 10, and potentially the Carnage cruiser behind is going to be able to move forward. And so them thinking, well, do I need to make sure my escorts need to be ready for that sort of play around the back, so I haven't got my vulnerable rear open to exposure. So planning ahead and working out where your enemy ships may potentially end up, and you have a level of confidence in that because of that minimum move requirement in the game. That's tip number 2. Okay, tip number 3. Never underestimate escorts, ever. So it can be quite tempting in this game for all your fleets to really go for those cruisers,
battleships and really use those big ships of the line. But the humble escort is incredibly valuable in every single fleet. Certain fleets, they operate in a lot higher capacity. So Eldar have really, really good escorts, points-wise, weapons-wise, speed-wise. They're really, really maneuverable, really, really useful. And they have some very, very dangerous weapons on it, and for relatively inexpensive in comparison to a lot of their ships. Imperials and Space Marines really require escorts in their fleets to be able to help with the maneuverability. These guys being able to move at 90 degrees really can protect the valuable rear of a fleet and prevent that sort of flanking and attack from behind problems that you can arise in any scenario in reality. You'll see less escorts in, say, the Chaos fleets, purely because their cruisers are quite cheap pound for pound points wise. But even in things like Orc fleets, their brute ram ships, which are basically exactly a ram ship, they try and ram other ships, they can put out quite a lot of damage. And so never underestimate a humble escort. Personally, in my Imperial fleets, I love running a mixed escort squadron with a light cruiser support, and you put them kind of behind your main gun lines and main force to then mop up any crippled ships or protect that valuable rear sort of area. So, yeah, never underestimate. Don't leave home without your humble escorts, folks. Now, on the beauty that is escorts, they are valuable from doing damage, like anything, but they can be a really good tactical response to something you don't want to deal with. So, for example, I've got a squadron of Nightshades here, and on my enemy's turn, the Gothic class has put out a set of torpedoes. Now, I don't want my cruiser being hit by that. That's more valuable than an escort. So in your movement phase, you can make a choice to essentially make a sacrificial lamb of one plucky little tiny escort and move it into contact with that. Same with bombers and fighters, you can do the same. And now what happens is that that entire wave, regardless of how many torpedoes are in it, it could be 3, it could be 6, it could be 9, it could be whatever, it could be 1. Same with bombers. All of those attacks go onto this ship now. So it's a good way of using one single escort, which may be worth only about 30, 40 points, to take out an entire huge wave, rather than allow that wave to hit a more valuable 230 point cost escort. So cruiser, sorry. So you're using a less valuable asset to protect a greater asset, and losing one escort compared to a cruiser could not only result in you losing a greater cruiser if you let it go through. It can cost you a lot of victory points in comparison, but also your damage output significantly drops as well. And by doing that, this squadron doesn't become crippled either. They're still at over half strength, so they can still operate in a pretty straightforward way. So yeah, tactically using a single escort to take out ordnance when you don't have any other ordnance options on the table is tip number 4. Okay, halfway there. Tip number 5. Generally, unless you're fighting against Necrons, in pretty much all other circumstances, you're going to want to fire your weapons battery on your ships before you fire any lances. And the reason for that is because of the way the weapons battery table and the gunnery table works. So when you don't have any blast markers on a ship, there are no negative modifiers to the gunnery table. But the moment you do have that, you then have a minus, you get a shift on your gunnery table. So there is a minus, there's a modifier to it, and it's a negative one. So it's best to fire the weapons batteries to try and knock down shields first, because you have more likelihood of having higher number of dice. And then subsequently to that, once you've knocked down the shields, Lancers don't have any modifiers with blast markers. So if you were to fire your Lancers first and put shields down, to try and then fire weapons batteries into that ship would mean that this ship now has a modifier where it didn't before if it went the other way. So that's tip number 5, folks. Try and fire weapons batteries before your lances. Okay, Admirals. Tip number 6. This kind of falls if you have torpedoes and bombers in your fleet. Some fleets don't typically have those. Chaos don't have access to a lot of torpedoes, and some other fleets don't either. Things like Space Marines, Necrons, they don't have access either. But something that the Imperials definitely do is have torpedoes and bombers and fighters, particularly their cruisers, which typically have torpedoes on a lot of their prow-mounted weapons, and then several of their carriers contain ordnance as well for their fighters and bombers. Now, critically, what you're trying to do with this tip is you're trying to focus fire. Remember back to the first one when you're trying to focus and pick on a particular cruiser and keep your ships together and then pick on one? It's the same with your ordnance. And there are multiple reasons, not only because you want to try and maximize your damage output, but all ships have turrets to try and protect themselves from incoming ordnance. But when they use those turrets against incoming ordnance, they can only select one type to fire at. So imagine, you've got turrets, you're asked as the gunnery crew on those turrets to be focusing on torpedoes, incoming torpedoes. Well, they're then not focused on the fighters and bombers coming. So when you fire your torpedoes out and it hits the opponent, it's best to let your opponent know that you're also going to be using a bomber and fighter wave into the same target. And then that allows them, as the opponent, to decide, well, do they want to use their turrets? In this particular instance, this cruiser has 2 turrets typically. Do they use their 2 turrets against the torpedoes or the fighter bomber wave? They can't do both. So it's a good way to get some of your ordnance through. So in this instance, they may select to fire at the torpedoes, and they may still go through, but then they won't be able to use any of those turrets against that wave then, which then again maximizes your opportunity to damage that ship. Now, personally, I always typically like to fire at the fighters and bombers. They could potentially, depending on the size of their wave, really do some serious damage. So yeah, that's kind of a bonus tip for you folks. I typically aim to fire at them over torpedoes. But that's number 6, everyone. Okay, number 7, folks. So in the game of Battlefleet Gothic, you can what's called fade out your ships. So fading out. So it's if your ships, you can do it at any time, but especially when your ship is starting to get serious damage and has a potential threat of exploding and giving up full victory points, you may tactically want to choose, well, rather than giving up the full points cost of a ship, so for example, this devastation gives up about 180 points to the opponent, I can fade out. And what that means is that you pass a leadership test on that individual ship. There will be modifiers associated with that, like if there's blast markers or celestial phenomenon, or the closeness of your enemy ships and friendly ships and all that. They will modify, and you work that out. And then based on that leadership role, if you pass it, the ship can then leave. It's fading out. Essentially, it switches off all its systems, goes dark, and off it floats. It can fail it and stay in play, but if that's what fading out essentially means. And what that means is it reduces down the potential loss of the ship, but also reduces down the amount of victory points you might be giving up for that particular ship in the game and the scenario you're playing. It is scenario based, but typically that's what you do. So fading out, don't be frightened of it. It could seem quite cowardly, but it is very, very, very useful and can win you games, and has actually lost me games by not doing so. A friend of mine who I play here regularly, Dan, loves to do it against me, and quite often he wins because of it. So don't be frightened of it. Additionally to that, it is incredibly useful to do fading out in campaigns. So if you plan to do campaigns with Battlefleet Gothic, fading out is an important one of keeping ships alive because of the nature of the damage control and the renown in sort of processes in the campaign. Keeping a ship alive and potentially ready for the next fight is far more valuable than losing it and bringing in a rookie crew into the campaign, which have some downsides part of that. So definitely want to be considering fading out ships that are damaged in a campaign scenario. Okay, Admirals. The next tip I've got for you is the Squadron Rule, which is incredibly useful, not only for combining ships together for leadership purposes, which if you roll poorly on the leadership roll and it's maybe a 6 or 5 in some instances like orcs, and your other cruiser's got an 8 or a 9, then you can squadron ships together to act like an escort squadron. They move around together, and they can't break that bond. Essentially, they can be within 15 of each other, and they travel around with each other. So not only does that improve, you go always when you do a squadron, go on the best ship's leadership. So if you have a really poor leadership on one and a good one on the other, you always use the better. So that really helps in sort of passing those orders or potentially fading out, things like that. Okay, but also you get to combine the weapons batteries and their turrets together when firing. So, for instance, these two Carnage class cruisers can combine their weapons battery output, and you can get up to something like 32 weapons batteries, which is some of the most powerful sort of weapons in the game when you do that. It's good to do this with things like Lunars for the Imperial fleet, strike cruisers for Chaos. No, Chaos. Well, it could be Chaos, I suppose. For Space Marines, I should say. And it really improves your opportunity and improves the number of dice you're going to be rolling for these ships, which maximizes your damage output. So, squadron cruisers. It's a potentially. You don't have to do it every single time by any stretch of imagination, but it's a good tactical idea for any fleet to improve leadership and improve your potential weapons output. So this one is a favourite of mine, actually, and it is using torpedoes. Not necessarily, obviously you want them to hit, but not necessarily always hitting. So if you remember back to the first one where I said, the first tip, keep fleets together. Well, torpedoes are very, very good at board control and breaking fleets up. No one wants to have multiple waves of torpedoes hit their fleet. Because they may travel through and hit more ships, do more damage, etc. So torpedoes can be used to break up fleets, and they can be used as a bit of board control. Oh, I don't really want that particular cruiser going that way. I want to funnel them kind of more into my guns. So I'm going to fire them slightly in a way that protects that flank per se, or sail them right up the middle, and so it breaks up the fleet. So you'd be surprised how quickly people will try and move out of the way of a salvo of 6 to 9 torpedoes flying at them. So, good board control. And the last one may sound obvious, but if you know your fleet and what its strengths and weaknesses are, and you know the enemy's fleet and what their strengths and weaknesses are, then you'll go a long way to winning your scenario. So, know thy enemy, which is pretty much a tip for pretty much any war game, to be perfectly honest. But it's amazing if you know the speed and range and maneuverability of your enemy, what's the threats in that particular fleet, then you'll go a long way to winning that particular scenario. Is the fleet particularly fast? Do I need to make sure that I protect my flanks and my rear? Do they have a lot of ordnance? Am I going to be fighting a defensive ordnance battle rather than an offensive one? Are they really strong with lances, or do I need to use weapons batteries to strip shields? These are all kind of important things, as well as obviously always stick to the objective of the scenario. It's amazing how many games people lose because they don't stick to the objective, not just smash each other to pieces. But definitely, if you know the strengths of your enemy, this is my little Imperial Fist strike cruiser. If you know your enemy, then and know your strengths and weaknesses, then you'll go a long way to winning the scenarios.
So there you have it, Admirals. There's sort of 10 tips that kind of are generic for most fleets. There are exceptions to those rules, of course, but typically if you use a few of those, it'll go well. I just want to thank a couple of people who sent in suggestions for that. So Horizon and Bleachhawk, Little Blue Man, BFG Noob, Double Bass Fanatic, sent me a few of those suggestions. You can follow all of them and check them all out on Instagram. And if you have any tactical tips, any things that you've come across in the game that you'd like to share, put them in the comments. But I hope you enjoyed that video. I'm going to be talking more specifically about starter fleets and where to start with all the different factions in subsequent videos, as well as going into more in-depth tactics for those particular factions in the future. But I hope those 10 help, Admirals, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.